Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of the Head. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome again to another episode of the Head. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of the Hell Money Podcast. I am joined, as always, with my lovely co-host Aaron Redwing. I am Casey Rodamore, and we are here today to bring you the definitive guide to the astrology of 2025. Everything that we say will happen. It is all legal, medical, and financial advice. So act accordingly.
Yeah, you spent hours researching this.
That's right, hours. I really took the lead on this episode, not Erin. She just kind of, she had some input, a little input, but yeah, it's mostly all me for this astrology episode.
Yeah, no, this is my favorite episode of the year. I think we did a 2024 one.
Mm-hmm.
Did we do a 2023 one? I don't think we did. But we did like an astrology of Bitcoin one in 2022.
Mm-hmm.
We've done a couple astrology episodes, but I think last year was the first year that we did like a year ahead kind of review. So recommend watching that if you haven't, if you want to like check my predictions. We did that with Caroline last year. We're back in the same setting this time for 2025.
Yep.
I definitely want to go through some of the predictions from 2024 and just kind of review them and how they played out.
Yeah.
But I also have just like general 2025 stuff. I focused a lot on, like, I'll talk about Bitcoin, obviously, since we're a Bitcoin podcast, but I focused honestly a lot on Trump. I feel like he's kind of the main character of 2025. If you go back through my tweets, if you're a real freak and you go through my tweets from years ago, I was saying like 2025 is a huge year for Trump. I figured he was coming back in some capacity because there's just really crazy transits for him, which I'll get into. So we'll talk about Bitcoin. We'll talk about Trump. We'll talk about Ordinals. I will, as always, review your astrology for the year.
Excellent. Yep. Can't wait.
And just kind of bigger themes. Like 2025 is a huge year. Basically from 2020 until 2024, a lot of the astrological transits that were happening were kind of like clearing out. Like it was a lot of like energy leaving, final endings, closure, that kind of stuff. 2025 is not the first year that we're getting new energy. We got some new energy for the first time in 2023 with Pluto going into Aquarius for like 2 months. And then in 2024, Pluto was in Aquarius for 8 months out of the year. It currently is in Aquarius. So like that was like some new energy that came in. But now with 2025, where we've got Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto all in new signs. Those are the furthest out planets, right?
Which are the slowest and that are sort of mark sort of larger transitions and trends.
Yeah.
But before we get into it, let's do a little bit of a methodological segment.
Right.
So like how did you do all this,
So
also for the people who want to follow along at home.
Right, exactly, who may want to do their own research. So I primarily look at the outer planets. Different astrologers have
which ones are the outer planets?
Outer planets are like, I mean, you could kind of define it as like the gas giants, although that's a little bit of like that, which would be Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, Pluto.
Did Pluto's standing in astrology change at all when it was downgraded?
No, I mean, astrologers also use asteroids and dwarf planets. Like in particular, like Chiron, I use a lot. Chiron's an asteroid, which is like way, way, way smaller than any of those things. So, Pluto has kind of not lost its standing astrologically. Also, just because I think Pluto astrology is some of the most interesting astrology. It's pretty hard. Like it just literally like the fucking Ray Dalio 250-year cycle of empires. You know what I'm talking about? Where he like has that whole chart.
Yeah.
That's 250 years is the Pluto orbit. Yep. So it's like, I would say in terms of all of the various like astrological bodies, like Pluto is probably one of the most important ones. So it's like, yeah, you're not going to downgrade that. Like it's too solid.
Yeah.
But it's kind of interesting. The outer planets were only discovered in the last couple hundred years. So in terms of like ancient astrology is thousands of years old. It's like a natural thing to try to do, right? Like to look at the stars, notice that a couple of them are moving, even though like the rest of them are not, and be like, oh, maybe there's some importance or meaning to that. So astrology has been around for thousands of years, but it was only up until Saturn. So it was like Sun, Moon, Venus, Mercury, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, because that's what you can see with the naked eye. Like I could look into the sky right now, even in a relatively urban area with like a lot of light pollution, you can still see Saturn.
When there's no light pollution, like in ancient times, are there any astrological objects that were not visible that are now visible that we use in astrology?
Exactly. So that's Uranus, Neptune, Pluto.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah. So Uranus was, I believe, the first one to be discovered in like the 1700s with just better telescopes, better optics. And then Neptune and Pluto were discovered later. I believe that's true. I think Uranus was discovered first, but still like 1700, that's like not that long ago in terms of something that's been practiced over thousands of years.
Who was, how has the tradition of astrology been transmitted? Like in, let's say, going back, like in the 1900s, were people doing things that was very recognizable as in the vein of today's astrology in the 1800s and the 1700s and in the 1600s? Like, when did it take shape, or is it really sort of an unbroken lineage?
There's quite a marked difference between ancient astrology and modern astrology, probably starting in the like 1900s actually is like around when things changed. Part of that is the discovery of other planets. So like, even like the naming of the outer planets, like the planets are all named after like mythological, like Roman Greek gods, right? And the mythology of the planets plays into the interpretation that astrologers use. So like Pluto is like, it's the Hades figure. It's like the god of the underworld. That is like in its name. Like Pluto is Hades. Pluto, I think, is the Roman. Hades is the Greek version. But like that name it informs what astrologers think of for Pluto. So even just the fact that we discovered these things and we named them, and the namings were not by astrologers, it's by astronomers, right?
Yeah, interesting.
And by that point, the divide had already happened.
It's interesting that there's this interplay that happens that like, okay, these astronomers discover a new planet and they name it after an ancient Roman god.
Yeah.
And then the astronomers kind of use that naming to like backport this planet into the astrologer,
into the mythology of it. Yeah, exactly. Like so there's a little bit of controversy. Like Uranus, which is named after the god Uranos, which is like I think it's Saturn's son. Is that I could be wrong, but like Saturn eating its child. Do you know what I'm talking about? That famous painting.
I thought it was Jupiter eating his child.
No, it's Saturn. It's Saturn. So I think Uranos is Saturn's son, or he's Saturn's father, whatever. With Uranos, there's like a little bit of weird kind of like astrologers disagree a little bit with that naming. Neptune and Pluto are pretty solid. Like astrologers are happy with that. But Uranus, like the energy astrologically is actually much more aligned with like Prometheus in terms of mythology. I don't really know why that divide happened, but I would say that's probably the most controversial, like modern planet that was named.
When did the divide between astronomers and astrologers really solidify?
It was kind of with the like Enlightenment and the scientific revolution. So like Galileo was primarily an astrologer and then he did astronomy on the side. That was kind of the case before like I mean, if you think about it, it makes sense. Like when we did the shift from viewing the Earth at the center of the solar system or the center of the universe to now the sun is the center, that's not really that compatible with the way that astrologers think about things. So that was kind of like a dividing point.
You could imagine an alternative reality where astronomy or astrology really actually changed at that point. The astronomers were like, oh, the Earth is at the center of the solar system. And the astrologers were like, oh shit, we need to like rework
We're redoing everything. Yeah, but then you don't get like retrogrades and you don't get like the Earth
retrograde
stuff.
is like a fun thing.
Yeah.
And that's where the apparent motion of a planet goes backwards, which we used to think like, we had this like epicycle model where, I don't know if I'm using the word epicycle right, but where we're like, oh, the planets they go around, and then there's a smaller cycle that they take, and that explains, the retrograde. And that all kind of went away when we have the ultimately simpler model of like the sun.
Yeah, that it's apparent retrograde motion instead of true retrograde motion. And like the retrogrades, because they're based on the fact that like we're orbiting the sun and the planet that's like retrograde or direct is also orbiting the sun. Like when you draw it out, it has beautiful patterns. So it's like there is like a mathematical kind of like, oh, I guess it just moves this way. Like that I think you could have conceived of that obviously like is a much simpler model when you don't put the Earth at the center.
What's really interesting is that the split or we had these like disciplines in the past that encompassed like many, many things, and they encompass sort of scientific things and then sort of spiritual or pseudoscientific things. And then there was essentially the science part developed to the point where we had this like scientific tradition that didn't support any of the spiritual stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a split in that discipline, but the two sides of the split continued, right? Like astrology and astronomy, chemistry and alchemy, sort of healing, human like physiology and healing, versus that one's really complicated. There's no like two sides of that split, because it's like, you know, all sorts of like folk medicine and like various like energies and chakras and stuff. I'm trying to think if there's other ones.
I mean, I think like the reason why you get the split and then you also see some things still progress is like you're essentially describing the split between religion and science.
Yep.
So like astrology was totally fine with the Catholic Church and the Christian Church. Like, you know, Galileo was like locked away on house arrest. It wasn't because he like was doing astrology. Like they were totally fine with that because astrology, they had like some tension where it's like if you started doing like, oh, the planets are gods too much, then like the Christian Church or the Catholic Church would be pissed about that.
Yep.
If you started doing a little bit too much like predicting with it, they didn't like that either. But it was much more like weather. Like that was kind of the vibe. Like it was like, you know, you would go to an astrologer and they'd say like, these are unfortunate dates that are like not good for you to do X, Y, or Z. And you would kind of listen to that as more like a prescription of like the weather, the astrological weather of the day. And the church was fine with that because it still had the earth as the center, which is like the biblical like interpretation of the solar system. And so like, I think the reason why you see certain things kind of like, you know, astronomy and astrology like continue in their paths is because like astrology was still being practiced under like a little bit of like a religious kind of thing.
Yeah.
Whereas like alchemy doesn't fit as much in like a religious, like, and of course there are still people that like practice that type of shit. There's people out there making potions. Still.
Yeah. A lot of it, like alchemy though, like it really fell off a lot harder than astrology fell off, right? Nobody is like doing that shit. Some stuff just went away. Like nobody talks about the humors anymore.
Right.
You know what the humors are? Like the, you know, oh, the big fluids of the body, like the big 5 fluids of the body that like, oh, you're like bilious or like, you know, sanguine or whatever. Like that shit kind of fell off. But astrology, like, you know.
Astrology did also kind of fall off for a while. So the reason why I say like 1900s is sort of when like modern astrology popped off is because a lot of the resurgence of astrology in the modern age was due to newspapers. So newspapers, like whenever they started doing daily papers, they needed content to fill every single day. And so there was an astrology report, an economics report, and a weather report.
I also think it's really cute how astrology, there's something about it that really appeals to people. And so you see astrology like things in every culture, right? There are these like fortune telling things. Like in every culture, there's some sort of column in the daily paper where they tell you about like the vibes of the day. And in America, that's like Western astrology. In Asia, it's other like Eastern astrology traditions, you know.
It's something you can look at like the daily transits of. There's like not that many things that you can. And actually, like, I mean, going really deep into it, I did this whole deep dive at one point of the connection between astrology and Keynesian economics. Because basically astrology and Keynesian economics came up like into popularity at a similar time. And part of that was because in like a news like company, you would have economists that were working with astrologers. And so like a lot of the, like, I think a lot of the reason why these economic models end up kind of doing the same thing as astrology in terms of like Ray Dalio's 250-year cycle. Like there's been studies to show that there's like an influence between those two groups just socially. I mean, even think about like, you are not like an astrology respector in like the sense that you don't believe in it or use it. But the fact that you're around me means you do things like make a podcast about astrology. Right. You know, like I think there's like some soft influence that astrology had over like economics.
Yeah. Astrology, soft power, you know.
Yeah. It's like literally true. It's kind of insane. And it's boy math and girl math too. It's like both of them were just trying to like read patterns and like ascribe like meaning out of them. So it's a similar kind of like part of your brain, I think, that's activated by both things. But like they didn't even do horoscopes until the 1900s. Like daily horoscopes were an invention from newspapers.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. And daily horoscopes are kind of bullshit. Like, so the way that horoscopes are written is like you take a chart and you orient it around each sign. So like I would take today's chart, like the planetary positions, And then let's say I'm writing a horoscope for Aries.
Mm-hmm.
I put Aries at like the beginning of the chart, like at the rising sign is what it's called. And then I look and see where all the planets are in that chart.
Mm-hmm.
And then I say, oh, okay, so Saturn is, or like the full moon is happening in your third house. And that's the house of like siblings and communication. And so maybe you're going to have some big ending or big moment with like your siblings or people close in your life. But that's like all of those interpretations have to do with the rising sign, not the sun sign. So when you're reading, this is pro tip.
Right.
When
Yeah.
you're reading
So
horoscopes, you should read for your rising sign.
Right.
Not
Everybody's
for your sun
sign is their sun sign. That's what we think of as people's sign. And
Yeah.
then that gets used. I think, well, does it get used for convenience because everybody has a single
It's
rising
convenience,
sign?
yeah.
That how would you do a more accurate horoscope, a more accurate newspaper horoscope where people could pick like which sign they were and then read that horoscope?
So if you wanted to do it on sun sign, it's just a little bit more, you can't say as much. Like,
No.
so,
I mean, does everybody has a rising sign like they have their sun sign?
yeah, but you need to know you need to have drawn up your chart to get it. Like your sun sign is just your birthday. It's really easy for anyone to be like, I'm a Pisces,
Right.
I'm a whatever.
Yeah.
But the rising sign is, it's actually like more specific. It's based on your time of birth.
Right.
So you have to even know that to get your rising sign.
Right. So
and it changes like every 2 hours. So like if you don't have like a really accurate time,
Right.
you're not going to
Right.
have an accurate rising sign.
So they could make a somewhat personalized horoscope for everybody. They probably the innovation of using the sun sign as the primary sign was what allowed that.
Yeah, and it's not like total, like you can look at horoscopes for your sun sign, but it's only going to be relevant if there's something happening in your sign. So like if, let's say I'm writing a horoscope for an Aries rising and like it happens that full moon is in Aries, that will be impacting Aries suns as well. But if the full moon just is in another part of their chart and I'm saying, oh, well, it's in this part of your chart, that's not actually going to be in that part of your chart, you know? So like, it's just like, I think in terms of like having something to say every single day for a sign, you kind of have to write them for the rising sign because there's just not enough going on in every single sign every single day. Like that's essentially why it happened. But yeah, pro tip, use it for your rising sign, not for your sun sign. But yeah, so like, I mean, modern and ancient astrology, obviously modern astrology, like it uses all the vocabulary of ancient astrology. Like all the signs are the same. The planets like are the same from their ancient like interpretations. We've added on things with the new like planets that we've discovered. But like, it's kind of cool. Like I feel lucky that I feel like I'm kind of living in like the golden age of outer planet astrology. Like it literally is something that only came about in the last couple hundred years. And it only really became kind of revitalized since like the 1900s with newspapers kind of like employing more astrologers.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's like a big reason, honestly, why I like outer planet astrology is just because I think there's like more interesting work to be done.
Sure. Yeah.
You know, like from like a research perspective.
Yep. And also I think it's also more interesting because it maps onto large things that we care about, large, slow changes.
Yeah.
As opposed to the inner planets, which, you know, they move more frequently. And so it's harder to do these like long-term like trends. It really fills out the astrological like canon.
Lexicon. Yeah. It's also like Uranus is the closest of the outer planets, like the ones that have been discovered since the last couple hundred years. And its orbital period is 84 years. So like that's not super interesting to look at an individual person. But it's super interesting to look at like a country, you know? So, yeah, I don't know. So like that being said, like I feel like, you know, we should get into the astrology, but I think something that oftentimes people want from like me as a Bitcoin astrologer that I don't actually end up doing that much is like trading astrology, like day-to-day shit, you know? And like you can do that. I think it's a little bullshit just in the sense of like, it's bullshit in the same way that TA is bullshit. It's like you just like connect dots and lines and you're like, tomorrow this is going to happen, or every new moon and full moon this is going to happen. And like, I mean, I've seen some compelling kind of like new and full moon stuff where it's like on the new moon, it's a high, on a full moon, it's a low. Like there is a little bit of that, but I think in general, it's just like, once you start getting into the minutia of pseudoscience and science, to be frank, like once you start getting into the minutia, I think you start pulling out patterns that aren't really there. And you're just kind of like, you're hungry for something to make sense of like these things that are like affected by many different things. Whereas like, I find it much more compelling to look at like bigger trends. And especially we're living through very astrologically interesting times. Like the fact that all 3 outer planets are moving into new signs this year or within the last year is crazy. Like that does not happen. Like 84-year cycle, 165-year cycle, 250-year cycle. If you divide those by 12, Uranus spends like 8-ish years in a sign. Neptune spends like anywhere from like 12 to 20. Pluto's similar, kind of like 15 to 40. So it's like for all of those cycles to like line up right now is pretty rare. But like, yeah, during some years, it's like you don't really get any interesting like outer planet stuff going on, you know? But yeah, I think like outer planet stuff is just more interesting to me. It's like there's more to be worked on. There's kind of like, especially also because we have so much access to data and information that wasn't as easily accessible even 10 years ago, you know? It's just like you really can kind of do like deep historical astrology, which I'll get into for some of this stuff. But let's start by just like reviewing 2024. So yeah, if you rewatch the episode, you can see some of the predictions that we made, but just to kind of go through a couple of them that I think were interesting. One of the things we said was that like February to March was when we were going to start, this 2024, was when we were going to start seeing like Bitcoin price action again. So we started 2024, Bitcoin was in like high 30s, low 40s. Crazy, right? Yeah. So specifically, Caroline
new
and I
all-time
said,
high, 106.
Yeah, 106 today.
Fucking wild.
Fucking awesome.
Wild.
I think this episode will go out like right before Christmas. So Merry Christmas, Degens.
Merry Christmas or other holidays that are celebrated. Happy Kwanzaa.
Yep.
Happy Hanukkah. What other holidays are there?
I think those are the big ones.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Yule. I mean, that's just like
yeah. I love.
One.
So one thing I love about just massive tangent. I studied in Sweden for a year, and one thing I really like about Sweden and holidays in Sweden is that they're Christian. But they're Christian in the most superficial way. And they really are these papered over pagan holidays.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
They don't call it Christmas. They call it Yule, right? They have like Easter or whatever. But all the time for all these like celebrations, they're doing like the pagan shit. Like it never died away.
Well, that's what I'm saying with the astrology. Like astrology and paganism are pretty close too, right? It's like Christianity worked pretty well with those. Like they tried to like assimilate those like traditions and cultures into Christianity, you know, like they played nice. And that's why like I get annoyed when people are like, oh, like, you know, you need to read the Bible. Jesus wouldn't want this. I'm like, ask the actual people who know about Christianity. Like it's not true, you know. I'm not a Satanist, guys. But anyway, yeah. So we started 2024. Bitcoin price was like high 30s, low 40s. And one of the things we said in the last episode was that like February to March is when we were going to start seeing like some price action that was then going to play out, and kind of like the way we talked about it was that mid-February into March was the first time that you were seeing something that would then kind of impact the outcome of the election. The election had really crazy astrology kind of from like February through November. We had all these really crazy transits that were all sort of like kind of playing off each other in different ways. And so we were at the time, I don't remember exactly how we phrased it, but we basically said like late February into March is when you start seeing like the first things that kind of like influence the election and Bitcoin price action as well. And at that time, we started February, Bitcoin was at 43K, and by March we were at 70K. So, you know, pretty solid prediction there. Yeah. We got that. And that was kind of like, that was the first time that we reached the previous all-time high of 69 or whatever it was. So that kind of like was the start. We also talked about how Jupiter in Gemini is really big for Bitcoin price action. S.J. Anderson, who's a great Twitter astrologer, you should follow him. He sometimes looks at Bitcoin price stuff and just Bitcoin in general. And he had like a graph that basically was graphing out the change in Bitcoin price for each Jupiter sign. Jupiter is the planet of growth and expansion. So it's kind of like a natural thing to look at for like explosive growth, price action. And he found that Jupiter in Gemini was kind of the most, like Jupiter in Gemini and Jupiter in Aquarius were the two kind of Jupiter signs that had the most price action for Bitcoin. Jupiter entered Gemini in May, and it's still there now. It'll be there till June 2025. And yeah, we're seeing another all-time high cycle. The previous all-time high cycle was when Jupiter was in Aquarius. So those two kind of Jupiter signs are like, that's probably the most like particular that I personally get with price action. Like, as I said, I'm not really like a trading price action Bitcoin astrologer. I'm like a weirdo age of Aquarius. Like we're entering a new astrological age Bitcoin astrologer. But like that one definitely, like whenever Jupiter is honestly, in any air sign, like Jupiter in Libra is also quite good. Like Aquarius, Gemini, and Libra are the air signs. Air signs have to do with technology, information, like the spread of that sort of like if you think about air as like it's what you breathe, it's how you communicate, it's like how you like it's the idea space. So really, like anytime that you get growth in that kind of like idea space, usually correlates to like Bitcoin high cycles. So we're still in that cycle until June 2025. So that's, I think, good news for the first half of 2025 price wise. We also talked a lot about the election 2024. And one of the things we talked about was like this end of democracy kind of vibe that like, America was wrapping up its Pluto return. We're now out of the Pluto return. That's the 250-year cycle. America's like 250 years old now. That the Pluto return of the US was 2017 to 2024. And so this election was kind of like the finale of the Pluto return of the US. And so the question was kind of like, okay, what were the initial values that the United States was kind of founded on? And we were thinking like, okay, individualism, democracy, hating taxes, like that's a big one, right? And so I don't know, I think like the Pluto return, it's a test. Like you can pass, you can fail. That's like when Ray Dalio talks about that 250-year cycle, like that's why I say it's related to that, because it's kind of like it's the lifetime of an empire, and most empires like fall after that. That being said, though, like the Roman Empire fell on its second Pluto return, so after 500 years. So like that's why I say it's a test. Like it's a natural cycle, but I think the question is like, I don't know, did democracy die with this election or not? I think you can have different interpretations of that. And I want to get into Trump's astrology a lot like later in the episode.
More in depth. Yeah.
It's
last
very
50%
crazy.
of the episode.
Yeah. Literally just me talking about Trump. But, depending on who you ask, like democracy's over.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, and that was certainly the tone of this election was like, you're voting to save democracy. And what's crazy is both sides felt that way,
Sure. Yeah,
like
right.
that was
Stop
kind
the
of
steal, like all that shit.
Yeah. And just like, the feeling that like obviously when we did the episode last time, we did not realize that like Kamala would be instated as like the running mate or the like presidential candidate over Biden, right? Like that was not a democratically elected candidate. They did not do a primary.
Yeah. I think that's so fascinating. It's interesting because simultaneously it was this like move on the part of Democrats to bypass democracy. And you can always say like, okay, but the party primaries are like, that's, not guaranteed to be democratic. There's no particular reason they should have to, select a candidate in any particular way. However, when you get into a two-party system where really you're going to elect one of these two parties, I think that does become critical to whether or not you live in a democracy, quote unquote. But at the same time, it backfired so spectacularly. They fielded such a astoundingly weak candidate, which they only could have done because they bypassed the primary.
Right. And what you saw in the actual election was that like Trump won like crazy, like it wasn't even really close. He won more than he did in 2020. Like every single county went more towards Trump than Biden.
It was really such an indictment of conventional wisdom, not conventional wisdom. It was such an indictment of the pundit class and what people thought was going to happen. And it just turned out that they had such these huge blind spots. I think it's maybe the first time. It's really hard to say, but I think it really felt like there was this split between what everybody thought was going to happen and what actually did happen in such a consequential way. And it feels like it was even more consequential than when Trump originally got elected.
In
it felt like people were much more sure of Trump being defeated or much more sure of it being extremely close. And Trump was not an unknown factor at this point. We had 4 years of Trump and then 4 years of Biden. And so people should have taken seriously the possibility that Trump would win, and maybe the scale should have like fallen from their eyes or whatever. But like it did not, right?
Yeah.
People really got blindsided. Nate Silver being like, I ran the simulation like 1 billion times and it came up, 500 million for Kamala and 500 million for Trump. It's such a coin flip. And then, I mean, did you see that picture of, rightward or leftward shift between counties.
Yeah, and every single one.
Every
went
single
more
one.
Right.
I
Yeah.
think ultimately, like maybe there was like 1 or 2 in California when everything was tallied. I think California's still tallying votes, by the way. It's fucking pathetic.
So like, guys, we can save it.
yeah, right. Yeah, just got to dig out a few more, illegals or whatever. But yeah, it was just like so stunning.
Yeah, I mean, so that's why I think in terms of that election being a referendum on democracy, in some ways, like we passed, like from my perspective, the voters decided very decisively and kind of against a lot of pushing that told them not to vote that way. You know what I mean? So in some ways, I think democracy didn't die. However, something that I think is definitely coming up in 2025 is a huge consolidation of power around Trump. So I can get into Trump's astrology a little bit, but so kind of to set the stage, this is actually like a combination of ideas from Curtis Yarvin and Nick Deegan Best. Curtis Yarvin is a creator of Urbit, but like, I don't know, monarchy guy, whatever, internet weirdo.
Internet weirdo and philosopher.
Yeah. So Curtis Yarvin has this idea that's actually this.
Who's the other guy?
Nick Deegan Best is an astrologer, also on Twitter. I recommend you follow him. He's on the Astrology podcast like once a month, I think. But so they had the same idea, but coming from different sides. And I just happened to be in the correct Venn diagram intersection that I could see both of their ideas. So the way Curtis Yarvin proposed the idea was that America periodically, of course, he didn't ascribe it to astrological periods, but that's what Nick Deegan Best did. America periodically goes through these cycles of monarchy.
Okay.
So he cited George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, and FDR as being these presidents that were more like CEOs that had full control over the executive branch during their time of rule. So like if you look at George Washington, I mean, obviously like that wasn't like a normal elective process. That was like a war that resulted in him becoming president. That wasn't like everyone deciding like, yeah, this is the guy. And he ruled much more like a monarch. And then he was kind of like setting the stage for like, hey, maybe we shouldn't have like another king. Like that was sort of the way he left it. Abraham Lincoln, Civil War was not incredibly popular. He sort of had to like exert his executive authority in order to make that happen. And then you see the Civil War. I'll talk about the Civil War more because we have a lot of Civil War transits that are coming up this year. And then FDR, similarly, FDR was president for 4 terms. He created all of the 3-letter agencies. He probably had the most control of any president ever. And, he led us through World War II, like the New Deal, all of that shit. Like it's hard to imagine a president in recent history having anywhere close to the amount of power that those rulers had in order to like enact change. I mean, we think about like the president has effectively been just like a mascot for a long time, like they're pretty ineffective. They don't have as much power as you think they have.
Yeah. And they really sort of just, the parties are very much the same. If I think one of the biggest indications is you look at like how much the 2 parties spend. And, Republicans are always talking about trimming the government and Democrats are always talking about expanding the government. But then you look at how much they spend and it's like kind of the same. They just spend it on different things, right? Like the president is just a representative of like larger trends, and individually is not incredibly important. And also when we have presidents who we consider to be particularly strong or particularly influential, for example, Barack Obama, that often comes down to not, they have some very interesting like personal policy positions or they have some, very strong, ideas or whatever. It's actually they're the most charismatic and the best sort of popular. They're the best statesmen, right? And so people correctly identify that. They don't say it, but they correctly identify that as the most important thing about the president. And it really indicates that it is kind of this like popularity contest, who's the most charismatic, whatever. That's really what's important about a president, not do they have like incredible control over the, executive branch and the office of the president advancing their particular ideas.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So if you put it in like astrological terms for those presidents all happened within 84 years of each other, which is Uranus and Gemini, and Uranus return of the United States, like more broadly. So every 84 years, starting with the beginning
I just
of the
want to
United
say
States.
I'm really struggling to not make like Uranus jokes. I'm just going to mention that once. It's a real personal struggle.
I think,
and we can just continue.
I think you need to wait for one that like really would hit.
Really pops.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I need to say something that like would be particularly relevant, and then you need to slide in with the
Yeah,
joke.
just don't use the word like prolapse or something.
Yeah. I'll see if I can I'll see if I can slip something in. Set you up.
Slip something in, to Uranus. Yeah.
So that's what Nick Deegan Best essentially looked at, was like that every time that Uranus enters Gemini, we get this like figurehead leader. He looked at it a little bit differently and in a way that I'm kind of like another thing that he pointed out was that so George Washington was not an Aquarius, but FDR and Lincoln both were Aquariuses.
Mm-hmm.
And he kind of like did a little bit of like futzing with it and was like, oh, well, Thomas Paine was an Aquarius. Thomas Paine was like who wrote Common Sense, was kind of like a big leader in terms of like the kind of like philosophical like direction of the country. So he kind of said like Uranus and Gemini coincides with an Aquarius thought leader who then comes in and brings in these new ideas. I like, if you try to play that out now, like who's the Aquarius that would be, it's like Alex Jones is an Aquarius. Like I've tried to kind of look at it and be like, who would that be? But I don't think there's like an obvious Aquarian figure. Obviously someone could pop up and I am looking, but like, but so he kind of like took it not in this like monarch CEO direction, but more like, oh, you get this like big influential Aquarius energy, which I kind of don't see playing out here. But I think like both ideas essentially like point to Trump having a lot of power this presidency. Yeah. And I don't think you have to like be an astrologer to believe that. Like that seems to be the vibe.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I do think we are kind of like, we're seeing Trump position himself as a president that has like the level of legacy and power of a George Washington, a Lincoln, and FDR.
Yeah. And there's a lot of like practical things that contribute to this as well. Like, I think that Trump came into office the first time, had all of these, like, we're going to clear the deep state, we're going to do all this stuff. I think probably we're good. I think probably Trump overestimated the amount of power and influence the executive branch actually holds. Like, I think Trump thought like, okay, I'm going to be like CEO of the company and I'm going to like start to make sweeping changes. But, when this company actually has this huge, incredibly powerful, unfireable bureaucratic class, I think deep state is like probably like overrated as a term because there's a lot of real like weird conspiratorial thinking. But like, when the country is so large, the actual organs of the country that like do things are not fully under your control. They're made up of many people that have their own culture, their own like way of doing things. And so if you want to change the way that the country operates, you are going to be going against this like class of people.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things he said when he went on Joe Rogan that I thought was actually quite revealing of this, and it was kind of interestingly honest, was that he said like, the real power of the president is to appoint about 100 people when they first get into office.
Yep.
That's like all the cabinet positions, all the heads of different departments.
Yep.
And then those people go on to appoint 10,000 people.
Right.
And so one of the things he said on Joe Rogan was that like, his issue during his first term is that he had no political career in Washington before becoming president. And so he got in there and he was like, okay, I now have to hire 100 people essentially.
Yeah.
He wanted to hire people that he knew from his life. But then when you bring some businessman into politics, it turns out like actually he raped a girl at a frat party in 1974.
Yeah.
And then it's like a whole hubbub and he doesn't get the job. And like they're not vetted essentially.
And they also don't understand how to operate within this environment and how to appoint those, 100 people that they're going to appoint.
Yeah.
How to actually like do things. They also probably think, oh, okay, I'm this executive. I have this power. I'm just going to come in and say what's going to happen. It's like, no. It's much more complicated. You've got to like appoint people who are themselves going to be effective within their agencies, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. And I think now he's so much more embedded in politics that I think he is going in there like fully prepared to like sweep everything.
Yeah. And also like, I think it's maybe,
which is what libs are concerned about, right?
I think it's maybe the worst case scenario for the libs that he won one term, lost and had this like regrouping period. Also probably consolidated a lot of power within Republicans. And that now he's coming in maybe much more capable. I still think that I don't know how. I think the big question is how much agency will Trump really be able to have? Not just Trump. How much agency will the Trump administration have? One reason that I've always thought that it's funny how freaked out progressive and liberals are about Trump is that I see him as being much less effective than they think that he is. I think they also buy into the model of like unlimited executive agency by the president, which is why they think, they're so freaked out by Trump. Like Trump's going to just start genociding trans people or somehow, kill all the Mexicans or something.
Yeah.
And I don't think that Trump has that. I don't think he would do that. But I also think one of the reasons that he can't do that is that he doesn't have as much agency as they think he has.
Yeah.
And so I think the second presidency is going to be really about like, okay, has he learned? Has he found better people? Has he consolidated power within the like existing Republican apparatus? Like, will he find that agency?
So I think we'll know by March, astrologically speaking.
Oh, really? Before he even takes office?
No. He takes office in January.
Oh, sorry. Okay.
Right.
Yep.
So a couple months after. So I have been looking to March 2025 for a long time as a really, really crazy time. I don't know what's going to happen because it's one of those things. It's an eclipse specifically that I'm looking at. But I genuinely think like something happens in March 2025 that like fundamentally shakes everything. The reason why I say that is so March 14th, there is an eclipse that is exactly squaring Trump's natal eclipse axis. So Trump was born on an eclipse. Eclipses happen 4 times a year. So, it's not exactly 4 out of 365, but it's like, that's the probability roughly that you will be born on an eclipse. So Trump was born on an eclipse and he was born on a lunar eclipse, which means that like the sun and the moon are opposite each other. So on March 14th, there's an eclipse that's also a lunar eclipse that is exactly by degree 90 degrees away from his natal eclipse. So basically his natal eclipse axis is squaring the eclipse that's happening then, forming a giant X.
Random question. Do astrologers ever care when the moon is exact? No, never mind. That was one of the dumbest questions I could have possibly.
Now I want to know.
That's so fucking stupid.
You answered your own question.
No, I was like, do astrologers care when the moon is behind the sun? Like when the Earth
they
is
would
over,
care about
when the
that.
Earth is
they
over
would
here
care.
and the sun is here and the moon is there. It's like, wait, that's not how this works.
They
like,
would care if that were to happen.
The moon is not that far away from the Earth for that to be able to happen. Let us continue.
Yeah. So a solar eclipse is like when the moon is blocking the sun, right? And a lunar eclipse is when they're like it's a full moon and they're just exactly in line with each other. So basically that March 14th lunar eclipse, which is in Pisces, I think it's at like 23 degrees Pisces, something like that. It's exactly squaring his natal eclipse axis, making this giant X. Also, Uranus, which has this apparent retrograde motion, so it moves back and forth. Uranus is exactly in the same place that it was on his July assassination attempt, which is his midheaven. So that assassination attempt happened when Mars and Uranus were conjunct his midheaven. Mars and Uranus are like kind of two of the more like rambunctious, like aggressive planets. So that happening at that time was very like astrologers were like, whoa, okay, like this is a big moment. Midheaven is the career and destiny point. So basically this extreme, like aggressive, chaotic energy happening over Trump's career and destiny. And I do think like, again, you don't even have to put this in like woo spiritual terms. Like that assassination attempt changed the direction of the election, undoubtedly. That was like a pivotal moment of like timelines shifting where it's like, Elon got on board with Trump then. Like a lot of people were like, oh my God, he's chosen, like he survived this. He got up and he did the fight thing. Like it just, that was a crazy moment. And so we're getting like that transit that happened for Trump in July. We're getting that again, not exactly. Mars is not there, but Uranus is there. Uranus is the planet of like rebellion, chaos, upheaval. Uranus is back there for Trump. And he now has this like eclipse square. For a long time, I honestly thought like this was him being assassinated, like for sure. I feel less strongly about that now. I think like in general, like I think there's a balance between fate and free will that happens in real life and also in astrology. I think it definitely has that energy there. It's also the Ides of March are, we celebrate them on March 15th, but they're really the full moon that's in March. Like historically, that's what the Ides of March are. So that's also literally the day of the Ides of March because it's that lunar full moon eclipse. Ides of March, most famous for the assassination of Julius Caesar by the Senate on the Senate floor in 44 BC. This was also a Virgo full moon in Pisces, like when he was assassinated. It wasn't an eclipse that he was assassinated under, but it was the same kind of transit. So we're getting kind of like, like if you take that historical example, and you kind of like put in this chaotic astrology, that's why I was looking at that even years ago as like, okay, clearly he's coming back. Like before he even really was like a big contender for 2024, I was like, there's no way that Trump is not a huge figure in 2025. Like that, from my perspective, whatever happens to him or that he does in March 2025, like that's the thing he's going to be remembered for. I think that's like his legacy moment. So that's why I say like, I think that let's say he does actually have this kind of like monarch CEO level power. I think that by March we will see that that's the case. Or like it goes in a different direction, And so I don't know. Again, it's like I don't like want to manifest anything by saying it. And I also like hope he's not assassinated, but there's definitely like some pretty crazy energy. And for many years, like that was what I thought definitely would happen. I think like just seeing the way that this election has played out and the way that the vibe has shifted since his assassination attempt, which he also kind of shouldn't have survived. Like, it literally fucking grazed his brain.
Yep.
I feel a little bit more like, I don't know, maybe there's some like chaotic, crazy energy, but we have the free will to do different things with that, know?
Yep.
But yeah, I mean, it's really, really insane that time. And that eclipse, like I looked at a bunch of different charts when I was like reviewing astrology. Like that eclipse is crazy for Bitcoin. It's crazy for the USA. It's crazy for Trump. Crazy for Ordinals too, actually. And so I do think that there's just like some sort of really big kind of geopolitical level something that happens in March 2025. I could say more like the Pisces Virgo axis has to do with control. So Pisces is all about losing control. Pisces like wants to lose itself in like the ocean that it's swimming in. Virgo is like gripping onto control. So in terms of like, if you view it from like a Doge Department of Government Efficiency perspective, like let's say that's the way that this plays out. I do think it's probably some sort of like pivotal moment in terms of like whoever had power or control before not having power or control, or that shifting in some way, or like a grasping of power and control. That's definitely a big theme that plays out. But in general, like, I don't know, I think while I personally, and this is just sort of like my vibe check, not necessarily like my astrological feeling, I personally feel like things have shifted in the sense that I think Trump will probably be more successful rather than like assassinated and taken down, just in terms of such a decisive victory. It seems like he's appointed a lot of people from like outside perspectives. He's like bringing a lot of like political outsiders under him now that I think probably he is like when you talk about like the effectiveness of him as a president, kind of seems like he's setting himself up now to be able to make like crazy changes, So, so I don't know. So I kind of like personally lean a little bit more in that direction rather than like the Julius Caesar direction. But something else that's kind of coming up is that, I talked about Abraham Lincoln and like the relationship between like those transits. It's not just that has Civil War energy. We also have Neptune entering Aries, which is the last time Neptune was in Aries was the Civil War. So, Uranus, Neptune, Pluto, these are the outer planets. Uranus is 84 years. So like if you think about the beginning of the US, like where Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto were, every 84 years we get Uranus. So that's like the Civil War, World War II, and now. Neptune is 165 years. So we have only had the Civil War and then now 2025. And then Pluto, it's the first time that we're getting like the Pluto return now because it's been 250 years. So these are like rough, kind of like 84, 165, 250 are not exactly like divisible by each other, but the planets don't exactly move like that because they do their retrograde shit. Anyway, the last time that we had Uranus and Gemini and Neptune and Aries was the Civil War. And those transits are both like I think Neptune and Aries is like Aries is the god of war. Like Aries is a warlike energy. I do think like even if, let's say that March 2025 time does not end up being like an assassination or whatever, I do still think we're getting some sort of like pushback, civil war kind of feeling happening.
Mm-hmm.
I personally feel like, and again, this is me vibe checking, not like astrology checking. I kind of think we're moving out of like a man on the ground style of war. And I think we're moving into a little bit more of like a economic war, cyber attacks, kind of like information war sort of thing. So
Yeah.
I think like whatever kind of
like propaganda, like social media,
yeah,
like
the power of information.
Yeah, control over what people are saying in public spheres.
Right.
The where the Overton window is. I think that I if you could link long-term trends to astrological trends, figuring out how the Overton window shifts, like what is the range of acceptable ideas for people to have and discuss, would be fascinating.
Yeah. Yeah. I think like whatever sort of opposition, if it's like a civil war type of energy of like political division in the country, I think the opposition to Trump is likely to be probably more like psyop propaganda stuff rather than like literal like physical civil war. I'm sure a lot of people who like would care about this type of shit literally at all to the point of like listening to this episode this deep in are probably wondering about like UFOs and aliens. Like I think like that's an example of something that like March 2025 could bring up. I have like kind of mixed feelings about the whole alien shit and UFO shit. I think it's a really prime psyop, you know, like it's like a perfect like attention grab, like, oh my God, there's UFOs, guys. Don't pay attention to anything else because there's fucking UFOs. Like, but I think like in that way, like, I don't know. I feel like the propaganda machine it hasn't died just because Trump won. And I think like they have to like kind of keep playing like more and more extreme cards in order to like get power and attention and like mass control. So I wouldn't be surprised if that's something that gets played, whether that's like real or not. But certainly that's like a Pluto and Aquarius theme. Like, yeah, like aliens are going to be a thing in Pluto and Aquarius. I don't know exactly what that means and what form that will take, but certainly that's coming up. I'm just looking through my notes. I mean, I guess if I want to talk about Bitcoin specifically, you know, as I said, like some people do more specific kind of like Bitcoin price action stuff. I don't really do that. Bitcoin has a ton of Aquarius placements. So basically we're just seeing different transformations and different aspects of Bitcoin over the course of the next 20 years as Pluto kind of makes its way through those planets. So the first challenge and transformation that Bitcoin goes through with Pluto and Aquarius is with the way that it's communicated and the way that people connect to it. That happens this next year. Like Pluto is right on Bitcoin's Mercury. I'm curious to see how the narrative around Bitcoin changes. Obviously, we've seen, the president of the United States like be pro Bitcoin, which is I think that's probably the reason why we're seeing such crazy price action that we're seeing now. But I'm curious to see if like he effectively becomes like a Michael Saylor like figure for Bitcoin, where people are like associating him strongly with it. And the things that he says have impact and everyone's like, yeah, like, what's your fucking spit in my mouth, daddy?
Yeah.
Like I'm curious to see if we see more of that or kind of just like, I mean, for a while, I feel like it's been frustrating the way that like normies don't understand what Bitcoin is, you know? And I think we'll see a transformation of how normal people understand Bitcoin. I don't know that it will go in like the cypherpunk direction. I think it may be more like a political association with a certain party kind of direction.
Yeah. That would be so unfortunate. If, for example, Trump was very explicitly pro Bitcoin and then the left was reflexively anti Bitcoin as a result. I kind of think that that's unlikely to happen. I think Trump has always, I think Trump his takes are often really wrong and very like superficial and very dumb. For example, Trump tweeting recently in support of the longshoremen and being like, oh yeah, we shouldn't automate the ports, put these people out of jobs. These machines break anyways. Just like really stupid understanding. And I think similar for Bitcoin, Trump had this like absolutely moronic crypto project. And so I kind of think the reality is that Trump will be good for Bitcoin only because the Biden administration was so bad for Bitcoin. that some of the sort of default positions that the Democrats have wind up being really bad for Bitcoin.
Mhm.
And so as a result, Trump will be good for Bitcoin simply because you won't take those hostile actions. But I don't think that Trump will be affirmatively good for Bitcoin. I don't know if he's like sophisticated enough. I think it depends a lot on who is influencing Trump,
Mhm.
you know, and okay, are there people who are influencing Trump who can play out this like long-term geopolitical game and be like, no, we should like start like adopting and using Bitcoin first? Or will Trump just have his own random opinions that he tends to have, which I don't think will be particularly affirmatively good for Bitcoin?
So I think it kind of depends on what you think good for Bitcoin means. So I feel like this actually kind of goes back to what we've talked about with like Noster and like cypherpunk ideals. Like if you view Bitcoin as solely a cypherpunk project
Mhm.
and that's what Bitcoin is, and things that are good for like the cypherpunk aspects of Bitcoin are what's good for Bitcoin, and things that are not like explicitly that are not
Mhm.
good for Bitcoin,
Yeah.
then I agree with you. I don't think, obviously Trump doesn't understand how Bitcoin works,
Mhm.
and the structure of Bitcoin is not good for his power,
Mhm.
you know?
Yeah.
But if you view Bitcoin as this like digital gold number go up technology, I think Trump essentially like views Bitcoin right now as this like ticker that's like, oh, look what I did for you guys. Like, aren't you so happy? Like, I got your Bitcoin up to 100K. Congratulations. You guys
Yep.
must love me.
Mhm.
And Bitcoin is essentially like the most effective lobbyist ever, in that you just send politicians Bitcoin, they become holders,
Yep.
and they become co-opted by it.
Yep.
So like, I view Bitcoin a little bit more as like, its strength is not necessarily in its cypherpunk ideals, although of course I love it for that. Its strength is in its like extremely dominating incentive structure,
Mhm.
where it's like, yeah, like the decentralization is the result of the incentive structure being so strong that like you're not incentivized to take it over, you know,
Mhm.
and like you're always incentivized to like mine Bitcoin no matter where you are. Like that's
Mhm.
one aspect. But then in terms of like number go up, like inflation hedge, whatever, it's like the more people that own Bitcoin, the more pro Bitcoin people will be.
Mhm.
You
Yep.
know, and
Yep.
so the
Yep.
fact that the president is a huge Bitcoin holder makes him that much more unlikely to go against it, in the same way that if any sort of huge lobbying like super PAC is donating to a political candidate, they're much less likely to go against it.
Yep.
So it's like kind of awesome. You kind of cut out the middleman of the lobbyist with Bitcoin by just directly sending the president Bitcoin.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yep.
So I don't know. Is Trump good for Bitcoin? I think it's more that like Trump is incentivized for Bitcoin number to go up.
Mhm.
And that is good for anyone who holds Bitcoin as a way to escape fiat
Mhm.
inflation.
Yep.
So, you know, I warned Casey that this episode I was going to come across super fucking MAGA, but it's really hard not to see the impact that Trump is like having right now. I mean, he's literally the main character of the world right now.
Yep. Absolutely.
Like whatever you think of him, that's just true.
Yeah, well, like he's a live player.
Yeah.
I don't know if you know this distinction between live players and dead players, where a live player is just usually somebody who's like the CEO of a company or a politician or something, who has the ability to have agency and move that organization or that country or that world in to affect the direction that it moves. And then there's a dead
Yeah.
player who all they can do is just be the figurehead.
Turn a little bit like the dials that are available to them.
Yeah, really, it's the tail wagging the dog.
Yeah.
You know, and Trump is a live player, and I think that's what's so scary. You know, like for example, Bernie Sanders, I think, is a live player, right? Like if Bernie Sanders has like a outsider political career, he's not like the tail wagging the dog. And that's why I think like, you know, people on the right are like rightly afraid of Bernie Sanders
Mhm.
because he could like move the needle, whereas they should be much less afraid of somebody like Kamala Harris or Joe Biden, where the dog is wagging the tail, you know?
Yeah. And I think like, Trump will do things that are good and bad. And ultimately, like things that might be good in the long run might feel terrible in the short term, and likely will feel terrible in the short term.
Mhm.
So I do think like, I don't know, as much as people are like, oh yeah, like bureaucratic inefficiencies, like Doge, let's fucking go.
Uh-huh.
Like that does mean that hundreds of thousands or millions of people will be out of work.
Yep.
And actually that is like the eclipse and kind of stuff in there. A lot of it is like it's impacting generational planets that are kind of like in the boomer side of the spectrum. So I do think there's probably like That's also why I'm tending a little bit more towards Doge, sort of like government inefficiency stuff in March rather than his assassination, because I do think on like a collective level, there's a lot of like big endings, chapters wrapping up, forced new beginnings with those endings, which does feel kind of relevant for getting rid of bureaucratic inefficiency. Yeah, so I don't know. In terms of like Bitcoin, like I really think like we're in a cool time for Bitcoin. Like, yeah, there's going to be like bull markets, bear markets, number go up, number go down. But ultimately, I think the next 20 years, we're just seeing like the narrative change around Bitcoin and the transformation of like how Bitcoin shows up in our society. But I think at this point, it's here to stay. Like it succeeded, you know, like we're not going to zero at this point, I think, you know?
Yeah, I agree. I think it would take some crazy, you know, literal like quantum computers break Bitcoin. A lot of the crazy tail risks have kind of gone away. I think the tail risks that I see are quantum computers break Bitcoin, although I kind of don't think that's going to happen. I'm very skeptical of that. I think that we have not actually seen real government crackdowns on Bitcoin. I think Bitcoin is underestimate how unpleasant that could be. And if, you know, government somehow got it together to be like, no, we're the beneficiaries of this fiat system, we want to keep it going, Bitcoin threatens that fiat system, I think they could really successfully drive it underground in a way that is like, okay, yeah, we crab walk like 20K from now until eternity, and like it just gets less and less relevant. However, I think that requires coordination, and the incentives are such that any individual government that goes against that, unless they are, you know, strongly censored by the rest of the governments, you know, they're like treated as an absolute pariah because they adopt Bitcoin. Any individual government is benefits from like adopting and stockpiling Bitcoin, you know? So I think that that's kind of unlikely. We've seen so much experimentation with alternative cryptocurrencies, alternative blockchains. That one tail risk that's always been there, that like, oh, somebody just figures out something that's like better than Bitcoin in every way, that has like perfect privacy and like instant chain downloads and like relies on some crazy moon math cryptography to compress the chain down to like a single 32 byte scalar that gets updated like every block. Like that's kind of going away. Like it's unlikely that is going to happen. What are other tail risks that
well, we had a whole episode about this.
Yeah. A lot of them just don't seem like super like plausible. You know? Massive cryptographic break is, again, you know, Bitcoin relies on the most boring cryptography.
I mean, we could always have a solar flare that wipes out the whole grid.
Yeah, I mean, those things are kind of less
That's
interesting.
just like, I think like the biggest risks to Bitcoin are like risks to the entire like digital electrical infrastructure of the world.
That just take us all out in like one go.
Yeah, it's like, oh no, we have to go back to like, you know, like an asteroid hits the planet and then like, yeah, it doesn't matter that you stockpiled Bitcoin.
Yeah, we got bigger problems at that point.
Which could happen, you know, like that type of, so I think like the risks to Bitcoin are more like just large scale societal collapse that results in like the sort of like digital electrical infrastructure progress that we've seen, like grinding to a halt or being destroyed in some way, which could happen, has happened, but that's the level of threat, I think. It's not like Bitcoin versus like Ethereum or like Bitcoin versus like the stock market. In terms of ordinals stuff, I tweeted about it like the other day. But I think with ordinals, we're kind of seeing like the peak of hopium in January and February. So like right now, you know, everyone's like, woohoo, like Bitcoin's up, like let's go, like lock in. I think that's probably like starting to peak end of January into February. And then I think we have some essentially like corrections and realignings that happen in March and April. And I think that's probably due to whatever sort of crazy geopolitical shit happens in March. That's kind of my prediction. And then from that, like the restructuring, by the way, is good restructuring. Like it's restructuring that will lead to like more stable growth over time. So whether it's Bitcoin or ordinals, I think that's true. I just think like my big advice for people, actually I have a couple pieces of advice that might be helpful. In terms of that, like March, April stuff, just like don't get attached to a certain outcome. I think, you know, if you've already gotten this far where you're like into Bitcoin, like you've had to think differently and think outside of the box and accept that maybe like the current paradigm that's preached to you is not the right paradigm, but that's like not the finish line. You know what I mean? You kind of have to keep thinking that way. And I think especially as technology progresses, like, you know, outside of Bitcoin crypto stuff, like the world will look very differently in a decade.
Mm-hmm.
And if you are committed to a certain thesis of how you think things need to look and what you think is going to succeed, like, I think you're unlikely to succeed with that mentality.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I think you always need to be kind of flexible and open-minded and kind of like willing to adapt and change as things adapt and change. So I think that's kind of like the best advice that I have for like kind of Bitcoin ordinal stuff, but also more broadly.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing that I wanted to talk about with Pluto and Aquarius, because now we're like fully in Pluto and Aquarius and will be until 2044,
Mm-hmm.
is, Pluto it's the slowest moving planet, and it has to do with kind of like collective and soul level transformation. And the way
Mhm.
that it does this is through death and rebirth,
Mhm.
from things coming up from gunk under the surface, making itself known. And then you have the option to like clear out that gunk and like deal with it, or the tower collapses.
Mhm.
And so while I'm very excited for Pluto and Aquarius, and I think it's a great thing that we all chose to be here for, it's not going to look pretty. Like, it's going to be a dramatic, sort of difficult, mucky transformation, the same way that Pluto and Capricorn was a difficult upheaval in the institutions and finances.
Mhm.
That's what Capricorn has to do with: institutions, financial systems, governments, whatever.
Mhm.
So 2008 till now, that's what we were like, getting all of like the Jeffrey Epstein level gunk coming to the surface.
Mhm.
I think over the next 20 years, we will be seeing a lot of that, but more in tech, AI, even Bitcoin. Like, we're going to have to deal with the shadow side of a lot of these things. And I think like the most important thing when working with Pluto is like, don't view those things as like an evil thing that's outside of yourself. You have to more like address it from like a shadow work perspective of like, oh, like, these things exist within me, and how can I like reconcile with them internally? And like, that's the way that like the consciousness evolution works from like a spiritual woo-woo perspective, is like, you can't look at these problems as something that's external to you. You have to look at them as something that's like collectively formed from all of us making individual decisions that lead up to that collective sort of happening. And I think like before we started recording, we were kind of talking about like paradigm shifts, or like, I don't remember what was the like word I was using for like Trump getting shot but not dying, like timeline shift, timeline something.
Yeah, just being on a different timeline.
Yeah, that like we were talking about it because Casey's like much more of like a physical realist, like not spiritual woo-woo person. And we were just talking about it from the perspective of like, various collective psychological phenomenon can lead to real world consequences that aren't necessarily like the result of like a specific action, as much as they are just like everyone together changing their mind and like manifesting a certain outcome.
Yep.
And like, that's not necessarily like you can view like someone trying to assassinate President Trump, or like soon to be President Trump, as like a result of tons of propaganda nonstop about how he's literally Hitler. Right. And I think like that's kind of the thing with Pluto that you have to watch out for, is like, if you're getting to a point where like you are viewing other groups as like totally outside of yourself and they're so evil and I'm so good and like whatever, you're like totally ripe for manipulation and brainwashing. So just like watch out for that, like the enemy within is often the enemy without.
Yeah.
So, learn detachment, learn self-awareness, and just like kind of work on the shadow sides of yourself. I think that's like the big thing to focus on over the next 20 years. Trying to think if I have anything else specific. I do have Casey Astrology.
All right. Okay. Let's
that I
go.
could get into your 2025. So I am doing readings for individuals, but only for ephemera holders.
Okay. There we
So
go.
you have to
That's
hold an ephemera
utility.
kit.
That's
I'm adding
actual utility.
I'm adding utility. So if you want,
Are they free? Like, how do ephemera holders get the readings?
So if you have a kit, like if you have a inscription, when you go to ephemera.gallery, which is our website, and you connect your wallet, and it sees that you have an ephemera like piece in your wallet, on the user page, a button will pop up to book a reading, and then you can book it through there. So that button's not available unless you have one in the wallet that you've connected. And yeah, they're free. Like, I'm not doing one for every single one. Like, if you have 10 ephemera kits, like, don't book 10 readings with me. That would be like way too many and insane. I'm just going to do one per human being so that I can actually do it. But yeah, please book a reading. I would love to like look at your chart. Basically, the way I would do it is probably spend half the time looking at your natal astrology and then half the time looking at 2025, kind of like key dates, important energies, that kind of stuff. And I love to do that. And I love to like just kind of get to know people on that level because that's like the language that I speak, you know?
Yep.
So yeah, please book a reading. They're open now. I think only one person's booked so far. So go for it. It's open. It's up there. But Casey, I'll go into your astrology. So we've talked about your natal astrology a lot. I think the first time we talked about it was Bitcoin astrology episode that we did in like 2022, where I like did a natal chart reading for you. Last year, we kind of looked at like the year ahead and we were like, oh, like April 2024 is like a really big time for you and Raph. That's when runes launched. That's when the halving happened. And then it was like, after that, it more focused on like you and me and like us more like building our thing together, which I feel like is like the podcast and just all the shit that we've done over the last year. So this year is like not quite as much crazy energy, which I think is good.
Yep. I personally would very much like to next year, next whatever amount of time, I would really like to be able to focus more and sort of make progress on the various projects that I want to do. Be a little bit less like scattered, really get more into like a routine. I think I've been doing that well, but do that more and be like sort of working consistently, but also balancing, you know, all the different, you know, social life
shit that
stuff
you
like
do.
that.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, so the stuff that's happening in like March and April is impacting your chart directly, but not in like a really terrible way or anything like that. Like there's quite a few, there's like a couple retrogrades and then a couple like big conjunctions that are happening at the end of Pisces into the beginning of Aries. Your sun is at 1 degree Aries. You're like right on the cusp of Aries Pisces. And then you have Mercury at the end of Pisces. So you have two very important personal planets at the end of Pisces and beginning of Aries. And like on a bigger picture level, all of those transits have to do with like closing one chapter and opening a new one. Pisces is the last sign of the zodiac. Aries is the first sign. So it's like a finale, an ending, and then like a rebirth with that. And kind of like what we've been going through over the last year and a half has been really focusing on Aries themes. So Aries is all about like, what do I want? Like Aries, because it's the baby of the zodiac, it's like initial identity. It's like, I want this. I think this. I'm doing this. Like it's a very action-oriented sign that doesn't do a ton of like internal self-reflection because it's just like very impulsive. That's also why it has to do with like war and aggression because it's just like these initial instincts. And so over the last 18 months, the North Node has been in Aries, and the North Node is like essentially like forcing us to address the more like evolved themes of Aries. So like getting comfortable with saying like, no, I don't want to do this or that, or like, this is what I want to focus on. This is how I'm being self-focused, or like not focusing on you or what other people want from me. And I think like that's very much your personality type in general. But I think you've like refined that and you've been challenged with that over the last like year and a half. You know, there's a lot of people who would like for you to do certain things that you don't want to do, you know, and I think you've gotten better at saying no and like being able to like set your boundaries such that you can like maintain your independence. And so that's that part of like your identity. I think you've figured that part out. You know, you've learned how to be like, no, I don't do this type of stuff. No, I don't want to do X, Y, or Z, whatever. That was kind of like the last like year and a half of challenges. Now, like a lot of that stuff is moving more towards your like Mercury and Pisces. And so I think, you know, in general, despite you being like a pretty bold personality, you're actually kind of like sensitive and shy and internal when it comes to more of like the ways that you talk with people and like communicate yourself. And so I think like you've kind of like mastered the boundary setting, you've mastered like the independence, and now it's more about like trusting more of your intuitive and emotional side and like figuring out how to like bring that more like up to the surface. Like a lot of that has to do with just like trusting yourself enough to like have emotional intimacy with other people, you know, like knowing that like you don't have to be so firm with like these set boundaries because like you will know when a boundary is crossed and you'll be able to deal with it. So it's kind of like almost retreating into yourself a little bit more, but allowing that to like push out a little bit more. So that's kind of like the spring for you is like you have your boundaries set, you know what you want, you know how you like to live, and now you're like letting people in a little bit more, which I think is a wonderful thing for you. The other thing that's like super positive, although it is similar to like the Trump transit in July in some ways, so it's like positive but also a little chaotic, is so Uranus is in Taurus, right? That was the planet that I said was on Trump's midheaven. My ascendant is in Uranus, so it was like Trump and I have a nice synergy there.
Yeah.
You have your midheaven like 2 degrees after Trump. So Trump's is at like 26 or 24. Yours is at 28. So Uranus is like finally making its way to your midheaven. So you're getting like a transformation of your career as well. And really, like, I think what this has to do with is like you're opening yourself up to a new career identity. You're letting go of certain fears that you might have around like, this is the way I need to like show up in terms of like projects, destiny, whatever. This is late May, early June that all of this is playing out. And at the same time, Jupiter is conjunct your North Node at 29 degrees of Gemini, which is also in your career and destiny stuff. So that's like potentially like money, positive growth coming in. So I think you're actually maybe figuring out how to like maybe make money or like, you know, have
good.
like a career identity that you feel happy
traditionally
with.
I'm very bad at that.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that's also like, I feel like maybe this spring is kind of about like figuring out how to like not just like assert your independence, but also like show up a little bit more like fully yourself on like an internal emotional level. And then from that, you're able to like have a career path that you're like, you're not feeling like, ooh, I don't want to like commit to anything. Like, ooh, I don't want to like whatever, that you're able to kind of like be like, no, I trust myself enough to like show up this way. So yeah, like the spring into early summer is kind of like a lot of like transformation, positive growth, but nothing like crazy. Like I would say it's nothing compared to like April of last year. And then the rest of the year is kind of just like riding it out. So it's a good year for you.
Okay, excellent.
Yeah. So that's what's up for you. I think I pretty much got through all my notes. I mean, I don't know how long we've been recording at this point. But
it's been a while.
You're like, I'm ready. But yeah, if you want a reading, book a reading, or I guess get an ephemera kit and then book a reading. I will definitely be doing more like specific topic videos. Like I went through a bunch of charts. So I'm going to go through like charts and individual videos. I think I'll probably do sign by sign videos if I have like the patience for it.
Yep.
Which you should view for your rising sign, not for your sun sign.
Yep.
This is our final episode of the year.
Final episode of the year.
Yeah.
Congratulations for making it another year.
I know.
We've been doing this for a while now.
I know.
Yeah.
I know. We're pros.
Yeah, we're pros. Yeah. I'm really happy we got our setup. You know, we have our 3 nice cameras.
HD cameras.
Thanks to our Patreon supporters. Thanks. We are now re-platformed.
We are
now
re-platformed.
on Twitter subscriptions. It took a while for that to go through. Thank you to everybody who has signed up.
Yeah.
It's awesome. It means a lot to us. It's just really cool. Hopefully we'll start rolling out the the perks.
Yeah, sign up for the subscribers because we're going to be doing like we post the episode like every other week. So in the in-between weeks, we're going to do like live streams or Twitter spaces that are only for subscribers.
Yep.
So we'll do our first one this week. I mean, that'll be last week when this is actually posted, but I don't know if we'll do a Twitter space or a live stream. We kind of have to like be experimental with it, I think.
Yeah, we got to figure out what the people want. We also got to figure out what we like to do.
Yeah. But we will be, if you're a subscriber, you'll get weekly content. That's the idea.
Yep.
And you also get like a little bit more like interactivity with like a live stream or a Twitter space. It's not just like us sitting here talking to each other.
Yep, totally.
So yeah, sign up for that if you want to.
And also thanks to everybody who just listens to the episodes, watches them.
Oh yeah.
We absolutely appreciate that. You don't need to feel pressured.
We love attention.
We love attention. Yeah.
Yeah, good luck in 2025.
Yeah, good luck out there, everybody. It's another year, rotating the sun. You know, we made it thus far. We made it, fam. I hope it's a good year for everybody.
Just keep your vibe high. That's really my best advice. Keep your vibe high and be open-minded and don't get stuck in your ways. And I think you'll be fine. And it'll actually be really fun if you're able to do that.
Yeah.
So yeah, we'll see you all in 2025.
Yeah. And see everybody next episode.
Bye.
Bye.